Imagine crossing an ocean, driven by the purest faith, with the sole objective of seeing the spiritual leader who inspires millions. Mari embarked for Rome with this flame in her heart, dreaming of the papal blessing in St. Peter's Square, a moment that would crown years of devotion. However, the Eternal City, a stage for empires and intrigues, held a very different destiny for her. Little did she know that upon landing, the news awaiting her wouldn't be one of celebration, but of profound mourning. A blow that would shatter her plans and thrust her into an unexpected and perilous journey through the streets of a Rome in turmoil. What happens when the cornerstone of a pilgrimage crumbles at the very moment of arrival? For Mari, the answer was an impulsive and stubborn decision. To stay and witness history, to see the election of a new pope, even if it meant facing the chaos of an overcrowded city, opportunistic exploitation, and her own vulnerability in a foreign land. This isn't just the story of an interrupted trip, but the chronicle of an ordinary woman thrown into extraordinary circumstances, where the spiritual quest brutally collides with the struggle for survival. Prepare to follow Mari's steps through a Rome few tourist guides show, a city of faith and fervor, yes, but also of shadows, dangers, and moral dilemmas. Follow her desperate search for shelter, her encounters with ambiguous figures, her faith tested to its limits while the world watches the smoke rise from the Sistine Chapel. It's a story of overcoming adversity, but also a controversial look at human fragility in the face of the unexpected, where every corner can hide both redemption and ruin. The air in Rome vibrated with an energy Mari had never felt before. As she disembarked at Fiumicino Airport, her heart pulsed in sync with the anticipation that had brought her across the Atlantic. Each step towards the exit was a step closer to realizing her dream of seeing Pope Francis, of receiving his blessing from the window of St. Peter's Basilica. She carried with her not just a suitcase, but a fervent faith, cultivated over years, that now seemed to reach its peak in the Eternal City. The image of the pontiff smiling, waving to the crowd, was a beacon guiding her thoughts and justifying every sacrifice made to be there. While waiting for transport to the modest hotel she had booked with difficulty, her eyes scanned the information screens in the arrivals hall. An unusual crowd was forming around one of the monitors, faces tense, some in tears. Curiosity compelled her to approach, trying to decipher the urgent Italian headlines flashing on the screen. It was then that a phrase, repeated aloud by a gentleman beside her, broke through the language barrier and struck Mari like lightning. Il Papa è morto. The Pope is dead. The phrase echoed in her mind, initially devoid of meaning, an impossible dissonance with the melody of hope that had carried her thus far. The initial shock gave way to an overwhelming wave of sadness and disorientation. Hot, uncontrollable tears welled up, blurring her vision of the hall that just seconds before had represented the fulfillment of a dream. Pope Francis, the reason for her journey, the figure she had idealized meeting, was gone. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet, the weight of her suitcase becoming unbearable, the surrounding buzz fading into a distant, meaningless noise. She was alone, in an unknown city, and the pillar of her trip had crumbled before she could even get close. The pain was profound, a grief mixed with frustration and a sense of personal loss. For a moment, the only logical thought seemed to be catching the next flight back, fleeing the brutal reality that had welcomed her to Rome. But amidst the turmoil of emotions, a spark of stubbornness, perhaps of reconfigured faith, ignited within her. She couldn't just leave. Something held her there, an inexplicable force compelling her to witness what would happen next, to follow the story that would unfold in the coming days. On impulse, she decided she would stay in Rome until the new pope was elected. Little did Mari know that this decision made in the heat of emotion and grief, would be the prelude to a journey far more arduous and transformative than she could have imagined. The Rome awaiting her beyond the airport doors was not the city of her pilgrim dreams, but a stage for unexpected challenges, where her faith, resilience, and limits would be tested in ways she could never have foreseen. The news of the Pope's death was merely the first note in a complex and, at times, dangerous symphony that was just beginning to play, leaving the climate-controlled confinement of the airport and truly entering the streets of Rome. Mari was swallowed by a paradoxical atmosphere. The city pulsed, not with the expected tourist joy, but with a palpable mourning, a noisy stillness. Thousands of pilgrims like her wandered the streets with lost gazes, sharing a silent grief over the Pope's death. Imposing monuments seemed to observe the scene with ancestral solemnity, while the buzz of conversations in multiple languages created a soundscape of uncertainty and shaken faith. It was a Rome in suspension, awaiting the next act of its millennial history, and Mari felt like a tiny particle in this vortex of collective emotions. The first few hours were a baptism by fire into practical difficulties. The language barrier, which once seemed like a charming detail, became a frustrating obstacle. Trying to get basic information about transportation, schedules, or even directions turned into a confusing pantomime. Currency exchange offices seemed to exploit the vulnerability of newcomers, and the simple task of buying a local SIM card to communicate with her distant family required a pilgrimage through several shops and a good dose of patience. Each small logistical victory was overshadowed by a growing sense of unpreparedness and the realization that her journey would be far more complex than simple contemplation of faith. The search for a place to stay quickly turned into a nightmare. The modest hotel she had booked online before the fateful news had canceled her reservation without much explanation, likely to re-rent the room at an exorbitant price. The city was overrun by the faithful and the world's press, and every available bed was fought over like gold. Mari traversed streets and alleys, knocking on hotel doors displaying no vacancy signs, consulting apps that showed inflated prices and dubious conditions. Initial hope gave way to physical and mental exhaustion as night began to fall over the mourning city. Amidst the crowds jostling in the squares and on makeshift public transport, Mari felt an overwhelming loneliness. She was surrounded by thousands of people, many sharing the same initial purpose that had brought her there. But the connection was superficial, diluted in the vastness of the historical event and collective grief. She had no one with whom to share her anxieties, her fears, the uncertainty gnawing at her impulsive decision to stay. The grandeur of Rome, which should have inspired, now seemed to oppress her, accentuating her insignificance and vulnerability in the chaotic setting. Finding an empty bench in a less crowded square, under the yellowish light of an old lamppost, Mari finally allowed herself to question the sanity of her choice. Was it madness to stay? Wouldn't it have been wiser to accept defeat and return to the comfort of family, to the familiar routine? The image of Pope Francis, now a painful memory, mingled with the harsh reality of her situation. Without guaranteed shelter, with limited resources, and lost in a city that seemed indifferent to her personal drama. The faith that had brought her there wavered, confronted by the harshness of the real world, and the night promised to be long and uncertain. The previous night, spent sleeplessly on an uncomfortable park bench, left Mari exhausted and on edge. Her determination to stay in Rome was constantly bombarded by the harsh reality of her situation. With the first light of morning, she resumed the frantic search for shelter, a battle that proved increasingly futile. The few hotels that still had vacancies advertised prohibitive prices, exploiting the demand generated by the papal mourning. Hostels, once an economical option, were overcrowded, with questionable hygiene conditions and an atmosphere that amplified her sense of insecurity. Necessity pushed her beyond the central tourist areas, venturing into peripheral neighborhoods that travel guides recommended avoiding. Narrower streets, buildings with worn facades, and the suspicious gazes of local residents formed the backdrop of her desperate pilgrimage. She consulted precarious notices on posts, followed vague directions from other lost travelers, and even considered options on apps that seemed more like scams than real offers. Each explored alley, each door she knocked on unsuccessfully chipped away a little more at her savings and her hope. Finally, after hours of fruitless searching and already feeling the pangs of hunger, she found a nearly faded ad on a side door of an old building. A stern-looking elderly woman, after much negotiation hampered by the language barrier, offered her a tiny room in the back, with a window overlooking a dark and damp inner courtyard. The price was exorbitant for the conditions offered: a thin mattress on a frame, a shared bathroom down the hall, and the persistent smell of mold. But it was the only minimally viable option she had found. She paid for a few days in advance, feeling the wad of bills in her wallet shrink drastically. As she closed the flimsy door of the room behind her, a wave of vulnerability washed over her. That cubicle offered no security, only a temporary and precarious refuge from the external chaos. The constant noise from the street, the unknown neighbors, the lock that seemed ready to give way at any moment, everything contributed to a state of permanent alertness. Loneliness, previously a silent companion, now took on the contours of real fear. She was exposed, far from home in a hostile environment, and the faith that sustained her seemed distant, muffled by the harshness of survival. That night, lying on the uncomfortable mattress, Mari understood on a visceral level the distance between the Rome of postcards and the real city, with its shadows and hardships. The search for shelter had revealed not only the scarcity of accommodation, but the fragility of her own condition. She was experiencing firsthand the harsh reality of many who live on the margins, invisible to affluent tourists and pilgrims. The spiritual journey she had come seeking was transforming into a raw struggle for subsistence, and the eternal city was showing her its most implacable face. With precarious shelter secured for a few days, Mari decided she needed to move, to escape the claustrophobic confinement of the room and try somehow to connect with the original purpose of her trip, albeit reconfigured. She ventured to use public transport, an experience that quickly proved to be a plunge into chaos. Overcrowded buses and subways with uncertain schedules due to closures and the massive influx of people turned any commute into a test of physical endurance and patience. Elbows, shoves, and excessive body heat were the norm, and Mari often felt crushed, both literally and metaphorically, by the anonymous crowd sharing her vital space. Her attempts to visit some of Rome's historical and religious landmarks were equally frustrating. Many sites were closed to the public as a sign of mourning or had restricted access due to preparations for the funeral events and the subsequent conclave. The Colosseum, the Roman Forum, even some smaller churches she had dreamed of seeing, displayed closed gates or endless queues that would discourage the most fervent tourist. Where she could gain access, such as near the Vatican, the human density was suffocating, making any serene contemplation or spiritual connection she sought impossible. From a safe distance, whenever possible, she observed the diverse manifestations of faith and grief taking over the city. Impromptu vigils in squares, prayer groups in different languages, altars with flowers and candles appearing in unexpected corners. She saw genuine pain on many faces, hope in the wait for the conclave in others, but she also perceived a certain media frenzy and commercial exploitation of the situation that bothered her. She felt like an outside spectator, unable to fully share in that collective fervor, isolated by her own journey of hardship and the persistent cultural barrier. The linguistic isolation was a constant source of anxiety. Although she had learned some basic Italian phrases, fluid communication was impossible. She felt invisible amidst the lively conversations or heated discussions erupting around her. Asking for simple information, buying food at a local market, or understanding the news playing on the television in the small cafe where she had her meager breakfast were daily challenges that drained her energy and accentuated her loneliness. The lack of genuine human connection was an additional weight in her already overloaded emotional baggage. One late afternoon, while trying to decipher the subway map in a particularly crowded station, she felt a quick, light hand brush against her pocket. The jolt was immediate. She spun around sharply, just in time to see a young man slipping through the crowd. Fortunately, her wallet was still there, safe in the inner pocket she had learned to use as a precaution. The incident was brief, with no material loss, but the scare left a bitter taste and an even greater sense of vulnerability. Rome, the city of faith, was also showing its claws, constantly reminding her that she was alone and needed to remain alert at every moment. On a particularly gray late afternoon, sitting on the steps of a lesser-known church trying to find a moment of peace amidst the internal and external turmoil, Mari felt someone approach. It was a man, perhaps in his late 30s, with a friendly smile and seemingly perceptive eyes. He introduced himself as Marco, an Italian freelance journalist covering the events at the Vatican, but who also felt a bit lost in the intensity of those days. He started the conversation casually, commenting on the city's atmosphere, the wait for the conclave, and soon noticed Mari's accent, asking about her origin and the reason for her visit. The conversation flowed with unexpected ease. Marco spoke reasonable English, and for the first time in days, Mari felt she could express herself without the constant language barrier. She vented a little about the shocking news of the Pope's death, the difficulty in finding accommodation, the feeling of being adrift. Marco listened attentively, offering words of sympathy and understanding. He seemed genuinely interested, and the feeling of having someone to talk to, even a stranger, brought momentary relief to her overwhelming loneliness. For a few moments, the harshness of Rome seemed to soften. However, as the conversation progressed, subtle signs began to cause Mari slight discomfort. Marco asked questions that were a bit too personal about her financial situation, where she was staying, her exact plans for the next few days. There was an intensity in his gaze that flickered between empathy and an almost invasive curiosity. He offered help vaguely, mentioning knowing cheaper places or people who could help, but without giving concrete details. Something in the way he gestured, or perhaps a fleeting glint in his eyes, set off a small internal alarm. Mari found herself torn. On one hand, the craving for human contact and the desperate need for any kind of help urged her to trust Marco. He was the first person who had shown any real interest in her situation, who spoke her language, who seemed to offer a lifeline in that sea of difficulties. On the other hand, life experience, the stories she had heard about scams targeting vulnerable tourists, and the self-preservation instinct that had sharpened in recent days whispered caution. Was he really a helpful journalist, or someone taking advantage of the chaotic situation and her evident fragility? The conversation ended with Marco offering his phone number, insisting she call if she needed anything. Mari thanked him, tucking the piece of paper with the number away, but without giving any concrete information about herself. As she watched him walk away, blending into the crowd gathering for another night of vigil, a shiver ran down her spine. That encounter, which had initially seemed like a balm, left a residue of doubt and apprehension. The thin line between opportunity and danger in Rome had just become perilously real, adding a new layer of tension to her already complex journey. The following days were marked by the growing anticipation preceding the start of the conclave. St. Peter's Square, previously a place of silent mourning, transformed into a human and media anthill. Satellite dishes sprouted like mushrooms. Journalists from around the world vied for the best angle, and pilgrims jostled in hopes of witnessing history. Mari, despite her personal difficulties, felt drawn to this epicenter of faith and power. She watched the chimney installed on the Sistine Chapel, the small duct that would soon communicate the fate of the Catholic Church to the world through the color of its smoke. When the cardinals finally sealed themselves in conclave, a tense silence seemed to hang over the crowd in the square. Mari was there, squeezed among faithful of different nationalities, all eyes fixed on the chimney. The first fumata nera, the black smoke indicating no new pope had yet been chosen, was met with a collective sigh of resignation and renewed expectation. With each subsequent dark smoke signal in the following days, the tension mounted. Mari shared in that collective anxiety, but her thoughts also wandered to her own precarious situation, questioning the purpose of her staying there, watching the drama unfold while her own played out in parallel. Amidst the waiting and observation, Mari reflected on her own faith. The journey that had begun as a devout pilgrimage had transformed into an unexpected ordeal. The Pope's death, financial difficulties, loneliness, fear, everything challenged her deepest beliefs. Was God testing her? Or was it indifferent fate simply running its course? The grandeur of the conclave ritual contrasted sharply with the smallness of her immediate problems, creating an internal conflict between the spiritual quest and the urgent need for survival. One afternoon, while trying to find a less congested spot to observe the square, Mari inadvertently found herself in the middle of a small commotion. A group of protesters with signs, protesting some church policy or perhaps just taking advantage of the media attention, entered into a verbal confrontation with more agitated pilgrims. In seconds, the argument escalated to shoving. Mari was caught in the middle, knocked off balance and nearly falling before being abruptly pulled away by a security guard dispersing the confusion. Her heart pounding, she felt the real danger of the volatile situation. It wasn't just the subtle threat of a pickpocket, but the possibility of physical violence amidst the crowd. That incident, though without serious consequences, reinforced the feeling that Rome at that singular moment was a boiling cauldron of emotions, faith, politics, and danger. Historical beauty and religious solemnity coexisted side by side with tension, exploitation, and unpredictability. Mari realized that her decision to stay wasn't just a matter of waiting for the white smoke. It was an immersion into a complex and potentially hostile reality, where each day brought new challenges and the constant need for vigilance. The passing days, marked by the black smoke stubbornly rising from the Sistine chimney, brought a growing anxiety for Mari, one that transcended the wait for the new pope, the financial one. The money she had brought, carefully saved for the trip of her dreams, was rapidly evaporating with Rome's inflated cost of living and the rent for her precarious room. Every simple meal, every subway ticket, every small necessity was a painful debit from her dwindling reserves. She did the math on a crumpled piece of paper. She had funds for only a few more days, maybe a week, if she was extremely frugal. Desperation began to knock more insistently. The idea of calling home and asking for help was humiliating, an admission of failure her pride was reluctant to accept. Returning now would mean not only abandoning her reconfigured purpose of witnessing the election, but also returning empty-handed. Indebted and feeling defeated by the city, she began to consider options that previously seemed unthinkable, looking for informal work, however precarious and poorly paid, perhaps cleaning in a restaurant or helping in a shop needing extra hands during those busy days. Driven by necessity, Mari began to explore a side of Rome tourists rarely see. She moved away from the monumental areas and ventured into popular markets, abandoned industrial zones, and streets where poverty was more visible. She discreetly inquired at small establishments, trying to overcome the language barrier and the natural distrust towards foreigners. The responses were invariably negative or offered exploitative conditions that made her even more apprehensive. She felt firsthand the difficulty of finding sustenance in a city that, despite its grand facade, also hid an underworld of need and exploitation. The deprivation began to take its physical and emotional toll. Meals became more spaced out and less nutritious. Bread, some cheap fruit, water from the fountain. The accumulated fatigue from sleepless nights in the stuffy room and long walks through the city weighed heavily on her shoulders. The constant anxiety about the immediate future, about how she would pay the next day's rent or her next meal, created a permanent knot in her stomach. Faith, once a comfort, now seemed a distant abstraction in the face of the concrete urgency of hunger and helplessness. The collision between her spiritual desire to remain and the harsh financial reality became brutally clear. The wait for the white smoke, the historical event keeping her there, lost its luster against the imminent prospect of being left penniless, completely adrift in a foreign city. Mari's journey in Rome reached a critical point where overcoming would require more than emotional resilience. It would demand finding a practical and immediate solution for her survival before it was too late. At the depths of her financial and emotional despair, when the prospect of spending the night on the street seemed increasingly real, the unexpected happened. While Mari sat on a bench, rummaging through the last coins in her purse and wondering what to do, she heard a familiar voice. It was Marco, the journalist she had met days earlier. He approached with the same friendly smile, but this time his gaze seemed less invasive, perhaps tinged with genuine concern upon noticing her dejection. He asked how she was, and Mari, lacking the strength to pretend, ended up confessing the gravity of her situation. Marco listened in silence, his expression turning serious. After a moment, he made a surprising offer. He said he knew an elderly lady, a pious widow who lived alone in a spacious apartment not far away, and who sometimes took in needy pilgrims in exchange for small domestic help or simply company. He offered to take her there, assuring her it was a safe place, and that the lady named Elena would be happy to help someone who had come to Rome out of faith even in such tragic circumstances. The offer seemed too generous, almost an answer to her silent prayers. Despite the initial relief the proposal brought, the suspicion Mari had felt during her first encounter with Marco still lingered. Was it a coincidence that he appeared precisely at that moment of desperation? Was the story of the pious old lady real or a facade for something more sinister? She remembered his insistent questions about money and her plans. She tried to discreetly probe Marco, asking questions about this Signora Elena, how he knew her, the neighborhood where she lived. Marco's answers were consistent, yet an inner voice screamed caution. The dilemma was torturous. On one side, the prospect of a safe roof, warm food, and perhaps even a little human warmth offered by someone who, despite the doubts, seemed willing to help. On the other, the fear of falling into a trap, of putting herself in a situation even more dangerous than the street. The image of Signora Elena, frail and kind as Marco painted her, battled against the self-preservation instinct warning her about the dangers of trusting strangers, especially in her vulnerable state. Accepting the help meant placing her fate in Marco's hands, at least temporarily. After a long hesitation, weighing imminent misery against the unknown risk, Mari made a decision. She looked into Marco's eyes, searching for any sign of falsehood, and said she would agree to meet Signora Elena. It was a leap into the dark, a gamble driven more by desperation than trust. As she followed Marco through the streets of Rome towards the unknown address, she felt her heart beat erratically, a mixture of fragile hope and deep fear. The consequences of that decision, whatever they might be, would begin to unfold very soon, adding another controversial and emotionally charged chapter to her unexpected Roman saga. Signora Elena's apartment proved to be real, a modest but clean and welcoming refuge, starkly contrasting with Marie's previous room. The elderly woman, indeed a friendly and talkative widow, welcomed Marie with maternal kindness, offering her food and a decent room. Marco disappeared after the introductions, promising to return for news. For a few days, Marie breathed a sigh of relief, helping Elena with small tasks and regaining some strength. However, uncertainty about Marco's true intentions and the nature of this unexpected help still haunted her. It was during this interlude of relative calm that the long-awaited news finally arrived. A clamor from the street alerted Marie and Elena. They rushed to the window and saw people pointing at televisions in shops, others running towards the Vatican. White smoke. Finally, the Sistine Chapel chimney had emitted the signal that a new pope had been elected. A shiver ran through Marie. Despite everything, this was the moment she had decided to stay for. Driven by renewed strength, she quickly said goodbye to Elena and joined the crowd converging on St. Peter's Square. A human wave charged with euphoria and expectation. Reaching the square was a battle, but Marie managed to find a spot from which she could see the central balcony of the basilica. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of chants, prayers, tears of joy, and the incessant buzz of thousands of voices. When the announcement, Habemus Papam, echoed through the square, followed by the name of the new pontiff, the explosion of jubilation was deafening. Bells rang, flags waved, strangers embraced. Marie, amidst that collective catharsis, felt a genuine emotion, a glimpse of the shared faith she had come seeking, witnessing an undeniable historical moment. However, amidst the celebration, the reality of her own situation surfaced forcefully. The Pope's election was a milestone for the Catholic world, but it didn't magically alter her status as a penniless foreigner dependent on the ambiguous charity of Marco and Elena. The collective joy wouldn't pay for her return ticket, nor would it resolve the uncertainty about her immediate future. It was then that Marco reappeared by her side, emerging from the crowd with disconcerting ease. His smile was broad, but his eyes held a calculating glint. He commented on the beauty of the moment, but quickly added in a casual tone that Elena might need more permanent help, and that he could facilitate things for Marie, perhaps with documents, in exchange for some favors. The nature of the trap began to reveal itself. The white smoke had brought hope to millions, but for Marie, it brought confirmation of her fears. Elena's kindness might have been genuine, but Marco clearly saw her as an opportunity for exploitation. The Pope's election, the event that had kept her in Rome, had become the backdrop for the climax of her own personal drama. She realized, with painful clarity, that her salvation wouldn't come from a divine miracle or the benevolence of strangers, but from her own strength and ability to escape the dangerous situation. Her impulsive decision and subsequent acceptance of Marco's help had created. With Marco's sinister proposal echoing in her ears, Marie felt a chill run down her spine, but also a newfound clarity. Vulnerability had given way to a determination forged in the hardships of the past few days. She knew she had to act fast, before Marco's web closed in on her. Using the euphoria and distraction still gripping the city after the papal election, she slipped away from him in the crowd with a flimsy excuse, and instead of returning to Elena's apartment, discreetly headed for the train station, blending in with the travelers. With the last euros she had secretly kept, she bought a ticket to the airport, her heart pounding against her ribs with every glance she exchanged, fearing she'd see Marco's face. The next day, before heading to the airport, Marie made one last stop. Not in St. Peter's Square, but on an adjacent street, from where she caught a distant glimpse of the new pope appearing at the window for his first Urbi et Orbi blessing. She saw the small figure, the ecstatic crowd, and felt a pang of what might have been. It wasn't the close personal view she had dreamed of, but there, from a distance, observing the event that had held her captive in Rome, she understood the irony of her journey. She had come seeking an external blessing, and had instead found an internal strength she didn't know she possessed. Waiting for the flight at the airport was a moment of deep reflection. Rome hadn't been the city of her spiritual dreams, but a battlefield where she had faced hunger, fear, loneliness, and human malice. Her naive faith had been shaken, questioned, but not destroyed. It had transformed into something more resilient, less dependent on external figures and more anchored in lived experience, in the ability to endure and move forward. The scars of that trip, the lost money, the betrayed trust, the constant fear were real, but so was the perception of her own strength. Mari realized that overcoming adversity didn't mean erasing the difficulties or forgetting the dangers, but integrating them into her story as hard-learned lessons. Naivety had given way to necessary caution, dependence to hard-won self-reliance. The woman boarding the plane back home was not the same hopeful pilgrim who had arrived weeks earlier. She was someone who had known the dark side of the eternal city and yet had survived to tell the tale, not with the radiant joy she had imagined, but with the melancholic wisdom of one who had seen faith confronted by reality. Looking out the airplane window as Rome shrank below, Mari didn't feel the triumphant joy she had planned nor the complete bitterness of defeat. She felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and paradoxical gratitude. Relief at escaping, sadness for lost illusions, and gratitude for the strength she had discovered within herself. The trip hadn't given her the papal blessing she sought, but it had delivered something perhaps more valuable: the awareness of her own resilience and the understanding that true faith sometimes reveals itself, not in glory, but in the ability to traverse the darkness. Mari's story in Rome is a powerful testament to how life can derail our most sacred plans, forcing us to find strength amidst chaos and disillusionment. Her pilgrimage, initiated with faith and hope, transformed into an odyssey of survival, exposing human fragility but also the incredible capacity for resilience. She didn't find the peace she sought under the papal blessing, but discovered an inner strength forged in adversity, a faith more mature and weathered by reality. The Rome Mari left behind wasn't the city of dreams, but a relentless teacher who taught her about herself and the complexity of the world. This journey, with its moments of anguish, danger, and overcoming, reminds us that the most transformative experiences often arise from the unexpected, from challenges that push us out of our comfort zones and confront us with our limits. Mari's story is an invitation to reflect on faith, destiny, and the search for meaning in a world not always welcoming. May her courage, even in the face of fear and uncertainty, inspire us all to face our own battles with determination. If you are moved by Mari's saga and want to continue exploring impactful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of Mari's journey touched you the most? And get ready, because in our next video, we'll dive into another surprising narrative that will capture your attention from beginning to end. We're counting on you.